Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, CEO and founder of C6 Capital Holdings, here with you again on Primary Vision Network. Today we're going to talk on OPEC, now that the deal's been signed, what's going to happen with US production, and really get deeper into what's happening on the supply chain with a big focus on Asia. So first, let's just touch on OPEC now that we had the quote unquote official deal. Now that we have it, the commentary is for 9.7 million barrels a day. And they act as though they're doing this out of the goodness of their heart, even though we know they don't have the ability to sell the oil that's slated for May. So why is May so important? So typically the physical market or the spot market in this regard trades on a 6-week go forward. So typically on April 14th, you're focusing on selling the end of May and kind of building your book for what June's going to look like. So when we look at May, we know that there's going to be a gross oversupply given the fact that Macron has now extended the shutdown till May 13th. And just today we have the diesel contango. Contango is just when the next month is much higher in price than the previous month, which is going to push more things into storage, which is showing you that oil demand is only going to get worse before it gets better. And then another big factor is India with Prime Minister Modi extending the lockdown for another 2 to 3 weeks and is now going to position things in terms of red, orange, and green to try to normalize on when people can start getting back to work. But until then, 1.3 billion people will remain in lockdown, which in total, based on what we've calculated, is about 4 billion people still in some form of lockdown quarantine. So when OPEC comes out and says 9.7, we have to really think of, well, what is 9.7? 9.7 is still not enough just based on where we are on actual production versus where they were in December. So we come out with a real cut by about 7.5 million. But when you think of cut, it's a cut to production, not to exports. And I think that's the biggest key is what does production versus exports mean? Well, in terms of the countries, they have curfews, they have lockdowns, Russia being one of them, and they've cut their refinery runs. So by cutting refinery runs as well as just local demand just means there's going to be more product to be exported. Plus, you've also had condensate, which is naphtha, heavy naphtha, light naphtha, that has been excluded from the deal again. And at the same time, you have to assume that people are going to actually hold to what they say they're going to hold to. So you might say 9.7, but in the last episode, we talked about 10. Well, 10 is still the real number, but the U.S. has offered to take 300,000 barrels of that cut because Mexico didn't believe that they had the ability, nor should they, cut the full percentage that they're allotted. So the U.S. offered up the ability to do so. So that's how we get to the 10, and that leads us into the G20 talking about cutting 5 million barrels, with 3.7 coming between the US, Brazil, and Norway. So that seems a bit odd, and now we can kind of shift to, well, what's going to happen in the US? The US is now meeting with the Railroad Commission in some dog and pony show that is a bit absurd in terms of taking capital, destroying it, and now saying that they need help because they need the Railroad Commission to say that who needs to cut where and do it a sweeping way. So why would some people really push for that? And it comes down to leasehold. You can hold your lease by production, which is an HBP held by producer, or a CDC clause, which is continuous drilling clauses. So each one of those has its own little contractual obligations, but the big focus is also MVCs, which is minimum volume commitments. If Texas or the federal government mandates this, you could say, well, sorry, guys, it was mandated. We can't pay you, but you're still contractually obligated because we're going to call this a force majeure. So they can start getting interesting in terms of, well, this is how we can get around paying some of these leaseholders who may put these leases back on the market. But, well, if you have a strong balance sheet, why would you care? Well, it comes down to condensate and condensate in this regard is anything with a elevated API, which is, just thinking about it holistically, is just the viscosity of the oil. The oil sands, or in California, the tar sands, are just thick, goopy, has an API of, call it 6 to 12. Condensate is very liquid and has an API of 60 or plus, and let's be fair, 55 is probably, where we should start. And it's more like water. So the viscosity matters. Now, the problem is there is no real demand for this in the market. So because there's no real demand, for every barrel of condensate they're producing, they're either breaking even or losing a little bit of money. NGLs, they're losing money based on the fact that prices are so low. And while you also have shipping costs are still elevated to get it to where it needs to be, which leaves us with oil. PXD, Pioneer, was one of the first to want to lift the export ban. But now that U.S. exports went to 2.8 million from 3.1 on their way to 1.8, all of a sudden they're the ones that are a big driver for wanting to force cuts throughout Texas. And when you think about it, it's like, well, is it because there's no export market? And I think that's really where this is getting to, is the fact that the U.S. demand, the demand for U.S. crude is falling precipitously, which is really driving down realized prices and is going to leave more crude on the coast. So when we think about who's going to benefit, it was always going to be Conoco and PXD because they had that direct line to the coast and could get a premium for their barrels. Now that that's started to evaporate, you're starting to see people change their tunes, while Conoco still has the ability to create a very consistent barrel, which has a place in the market. So when we look at this, we have to think about, well, what does the supply chain look like, and where is that demand really coming from, or the lack thereof? So the next time, on the next segment, we're going to go into, where does China fall, where does India fall, and how does this look on a geopolitical economic standpoint? So before we start the next segment, I just want to touch on the fact that we're going to start dropping some of our information just because we've talked a lot of numbers, a lot of different acronyms. So we'll put some of those in the comment section, and we'd appreciate any and all of your comments and questions. And at the same time, any subscription would be greatly appreciated, which you can see just above the Q&A button. So now let's just really kick off and focus on what's happening in Asia. And let's just focus right now mostly on China. So right now, China has had multiple initiatives to try to get themselves ahead of the world. So when you look at it, you can break it down into Made in China 2025 and the Belt and Road Initiative, which started off as One Belt, One Road. So when we think of Made in China 2025, the focus was to create a vertical integration, find ways to invest in countries and logistics to bring goods and services home while still increasing their influence in some of these growing nations. And the One Belt, One Road, or Belt and Road Initiative, was a way to get these products into market and to really expand their economic influence around the world. So when we look at what is transpired, it's really been focused on the 9-dash line. So the 9-dash line went into arbitration with the UN, and it was resoundingly defeated, saying that China did not have sovereignty over many of these shoals and reef islands that they've claimed. So now that we look at it and say, well, why would they do this? Why would they create sovereignty? And you have to think of natural resources. And natural resources in this regard is both fish as well as oil and gas. We just had another sinking of a Vietnamese fishing vessel by a Chinese Coast Guard. And the question is, well, why does China care so much? Why wouldn't they try to come up with some agreement? Why would they not try to come up with some joint venture or something that would be mutually beneficial? And it comes down to food. When you have 1.4 billion people, or 20% of the world's population, and 12% of the world's arable land, you have to think of, well, how do I grow my food? And when you look at China, there's something called the 15-inch line. The 15-inch line is kind of a universal term to say you need 15 inches or more of rainfall to support crops. So with arable land on the east coast of China, that's also where almost 1.4 billion people live. So the arable land is where people are living on. So how do you make sure to grow crops and support your populace? And that's really where this comes down to. How do they get more farmland, and how do they get more fish? So we've seen skirmishes between India and China on the Doklam Plateau in Bhutan, which is really a straight shot. If you think about how do you get heavy machinery over the Himalayas, it's through the Doklam Plateau, which then cuts straight down into the Indian Ocean. Now, why would that matter? Well, when you think of the Strait of Malacca, which is where the U.S. practices shutting it down actually about twice a year, about 70 to 80% of Chinese goods have to traverse that region. So how do you get around that? Well, it would be creating some sort of agreement with Bangladesh to send things up and through the Doklam Plateau, as well as Gwadar in Pakistan, which is the Pakistan-Chinese economic corridor, which would cut up and through western part of China. So right now, China is sitting there saying, well, our demand is falling across the board. We have to worry about food. And now we have to worry about how are we going to feed these people? Now, this is also creating uprisings because we've had Taiwan, we've had Hong Kong, and now we've had COVID-19 and the way it was handled. So these are things that are going to continue to become problematic, especially as you've had Romania add themselves to the list of restrictions on shipments. So India's a big component in terms of, how will India handle this? India and Pakistan have their own skirmishes, and the Indus Water Treaty, which was signed in 1967, is a big part of farming because, again, it's water. China has tried to increase the amount of water in the western part of the country by damming up a significant amount of rivers, which has created, let's just say, several man-made droughts in Southeast Asia, which is also another reason why places like Vietnam have an issue with the way China is treating them and their natural resources. So these are things that we have to focus on, and just a quick introduction to where things sit and how things are going to happen over time. And the big part, which we'll focus on in the next episode, is going to be Chinese debt. Because Chinese debt continues to swell as most of the country, as most of the world, as now we are at, I think it's 90 countries reaching out to the IMF for some form of support. So these are some things that we'll consider. We'll drop some of the information, some of those pretty charts, breaking it down to help kind of drive the conversation going forward. So again, this is Mark Rossano, CEO and founder of C6 Capital, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Talk to you again on Friday. Thanks. Bye.